The most dangerous man in Chicago saw me dancing in the rain before he ever learned my name. I didn't know who Damian Moretti was the first time I saw him. If I had, maybe I would have stopped dancing. Maybe I would have run. But that night, I had nowhere left to go anyway. The rain was freezing. The kind that soaked through your sweater in seconds and made the whole city smell like wet concrete and gasoline. My sneakers were ruined. My mascara had already surrendered somewhere around midnight, and the tiny silver bracelet on my wrist, the last thing my mother ever gave me, felt heavier than usual. I remember laughing right before I stepped into the street, not because I was happy, because when life takes everything from you, in one day your body stops knowing how to react. 12 hours earlier, I still had an apartment in Brooklyn Heights, a boyfriend I thought loved me, and a job at a downtown art cafe where old men tipped in quarters and college students pretended to write novels. By 11 that night, all three were gone. Evan had emptied our joint account. My landlord had changed the locks after 3 missed payments I never knew existed, and my manager fired me because apparently customers don't like crying baristas. So I walked 23 blocks in the rain with one backpack and nowhere to sleep. Funny thing about heartbreak, at some point it turns into exhaustion, and exhaustion turns into honesty. That was the first honest moment I'd had in years. There were no walls left. No pride. No pretending. Just me, standing under a broken streetlight, while thunder rolled across the skyline. Then the music started. Somewhere above me, from an apartment window left open despite the storm, Frank Sinatra drifted into the night, soft, distant, almost unreal. I should have kept walking. Instead, I stepped into the rain and started dancing. Slow at first, barely moved. My soaked jeans clung to my skin while cold water slid down my neck, but for the first time all day, I could breathe. Cars passed. Nobody stopped. Nobody cared. And honestly, that made it better. Because strangers leave you alone in New York when they think you're already broken. I spun once beneath the streetlight and closed my eyes. Rain tapped against my eyelashes. My hair stuck to my cheeks. I probably looked insane, but in that moment I didn't care. Then the black car appeared. Long, silent, expensive enough to look out of place on that street. It rolled to a stop beside the curb like something from another universe. The headlights washed over me. I froze for half a second before laughing again under my breath. Of course, the universe would send an audience now. The back window lowered slowly, and that's when I saw him. Dark coat, white dress shirt, one hand resting against the leather seat. His face was calm in a way that made calm feel dangerous. Not angry, not cold. Worse, controlled. He looked at me like a man who'd spent his entire life being obeyed without ever raising his voice. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, unblinking. I should have looked away. I didn't. Something about him made the whole street quieter. Even the rain sounded softer near that car. "Keep driving," the driver muttered from the front seat. But the man in the back didn't move. He kept watching me like he was trying to understand something impossible. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the bracelet on my wrist before returning to my face. I don't know why that unsettled me more than anything else. Maybe because it felt personal, intimate, somehow. I crossed my arms against the cold. "You gonna stare all night?" I called out before my common sense could stop me. The driver looked horrified. The man in the back almost smiled. Almost. It was tiny. Gone in a second. But I saw it. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was low, smooth, the kind of voice built for quiet rooms and expensive whiskey. I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to answer. But another part of me, the reckless, exhausted part, wanted to know why this stranger looked at me like he'd found something he'd been searching for. "Claire," I said softly. He repeated it once. "Claire," like he was testing whether the name belonged in his world. Then thunder cracked overhead again. The rain came harder. The driver finally turned around. "Sir, we should leave. Sir. Not mister. Not boss. Sir." The man ignored him. His eyes stayed on me, while water dripped from my hair onto the sidewalk. "You dance like someone saying goodbye," he said quietly. My chest tightened before I could stop it, because somehow, this stranger had seen straight through me in less than 60 seconds. I swallowed hard and forced a smile anyway. Maybe I am. For the first time that night, the expression in his eyes changed. Not pity, not amusement, recognition, like loneliness had just introduced itself to loneliness. Then the window rolled up between us. The car pulled away slowly, disappearing into the rain without another word. I stood there shaking beneath the streetlight, telling myself I'd never see him again. I had no idea the man in that car owned half the city. And I definitely didn't know that before the week was over, Damien Moretti would offer me the one thing nobody else ever had, a place to belong. I spent the rest of that night pretending the man in the black car had not unsettled me. It did not work. By 2 a.m, I was sitting inside a 24-hour laundromat 3 blocks from the subway station, wrapped in the heat of industrial dryers and cheap fluorescent light. My clothes spun behind the glass while I held a paper cup of burnt coffee between both hands. Around me, the city kept moving. A tired nurse folded blue scrubs beside the window. A teenager slept against a backpack in the corner. Somewhere outside, a siren echoed through the wet streets. New York never stopped breathing. But my mind kept replaying the way that stranger looked at me through the rain, calm, focused, like I had interrupted something inside him without even trying. I hated that. I kept thinking about it. Men like that did not belong in the same world as women like me. You could tell just by the way he sat, the way other people moved around him. Even silence seemed expensive near him. I finally fell asleep around dawn with my backpack under my head and Sinatra still stuck in my memory. When I woke up, my neck hurt and my phone battery was down to 4%. No missed calls, no messages. Funny how quickly people disappear when your life stops being convenient for them. Outside, the rain had finally ended. The city looked washed out beneath pale gray skies. Steam curled from street vents, while taxis splashed through puddles left along the curb. I spent the morning searching for work. Coffee shops, bookstores, diners, anywhere with a help wanted sign taped crookedly to the window. Most managers barely looked at me before saying they were not hiring. One guy offered me a job handing out nightclub flyers in Times Square for minimum wage and free pizza slices. I almost said yes. By late afternoon, my feet were killing me. I stopped outside a small deli on Lexington Avenue and used the last $8 in my wallet to buy a turkey sandwich and bottled water. The cashier kept staring at the bruise-colored circles under my eyes like he wanted to ask if I was okay. He did not. Nobody ever really does. I sat on a bench across the street and watched people hurry past in expensive coats while cold wind slipped through the buildings. That was when I saw the black car again. My stomach tightened instantly. It was parked half a block away beside the curb. Same polished finish, same tinted windows. I told myself there were probably thousands of luxury sedans in Manhattan. But deep down, I knew something about it felt familiar in the worst possible way. The car stayed there for almost 10 minutes without moving. Then traffic shifted between us. And when I looked again, it was gone. I laughed nervously under my breath. "You are losing it, Claire." Maybe exhaustion was making me paranoid. Maybe I wanted the mystery because it distracted me from everything else falling apart. Still, the feeling stayed with me as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. By evening, the temperature had dropped into the 40s. I ended up at a tiny soup place near Midtown because the owner let customers stay inside longer if they ordered tea. I sat near the window charging my dying phone when two women walked in wearing designer heels and talking too loudly. "I am telling you," one of them whispered dramatically, "Damien Moretti bought the entire building just because a restaurant owner disrespected his father 20 years ago." The other woman laughed. "That family terrifies me." My hand froze around the teacup. Moretti. The name landed in my chest immediately. Damien Moretti. Suddenly I could hear his voice again. Low, smooth, controlled. I looked down at my reflection in the dark tea and felt cold all over. One quick search on my phone confirmed everything. Real estate, shipping, nightclubs, private security firms. Half the articles called him a billionaire. The other half called him untouchable. There were photographs of him leaving charity galas in black suits worth more than my yearly rent. In every picture, he looked exactly the same. Calm, distant, impossible to read. But none of those photographs captured the eyes I saw in the rain. None of them showed the strange sadness hiding underneath all that control. I should have forgotten about him right then. Smart girls do not chase danger. Smart girls definitely do not think about men powerful enough to make entire rooms nervous. But that night, as I sat alone, watching steam fog the diner windows, I realized something that scared me more than Damien Moretti himself. For the first time in months, I had felt seen. The next morning, I told myself I was done thinking about Damien Moretti. It sounded reasonable in theory, impossible in practice. His name followed me through the city like a shadow I could not shake. Every newspaper stand seemed to have his face somewhere near the business section. Every conversation inside crowded coffee shops lowered in volume when people mentioned the Moretti family. It was strange hearing strangers talk about a man I had watched through rainwater and silence. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. Nobody sounded neutral. By noon, I was sitting inside the public library on 42nd Street, pretending to search job listings while secretly reading articles about him on my phone. Billion-dollar investments, luxury hotels, political fundraisers, charity foundations. One article called him the kingmaker of Manhattan. Another claimed he never attended public events without 6 security men nearby, but none of it matched the man I met that night. The articles described power, control, ruthlessness. They did not describe the way his eyes softened when I said maybe I was saying goodbye. I hated that I remembered details like that. It felt ridiculous. I was 26 years old, unemployed, practically homeless, and emotionally exhausted. I should have been figuring out my life instead of obsessing over one mysterious encounter with a billionaire I would probably never see again. Still, something about him stayed under my skin. Around 3 in the afternoon, I finally got lucky. A tiny Italian cafe downtown needed temporary help for the weekend. The owner, Mrs. Russo, was in her 60s and wore too much perfume, but she smiled kindly when she looked at me. "You know how to carry 3 plates at once?" she asked. "I can learn fast," I told her. She studied me for a second before nodding toward the kitchen. Good enough. It was not glamorous, but after the week I had, the smell of fresh bread and espresso almost made me emotional. The cafe sat on a narrow street in Tribeca, where expensive apartments overlooked old brick buildings. Candles flickered on each table after sunset, and soft jazz played through hidden speakers overhead. It felt warm, safe, like the kind of place people escape to when they wanted the city to slow down for an hour. My shift started at 6. By 7:30, every table was full. Couples leaned close over wine glasses while businessmen loosened expensive ties and laughed too loudly. I stayed busy enough to forget my own problems for a little while. Then the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough for instinct to notice before logic did. Conversations softened near the entrance. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside first, scanning the room with calm professionalism, and then he walked in. Damien Moretti looked even more dangerous in warm light than he had in the rain. Black coat, crisp white shirt beneath it. Dark hair pushed back neatly, like he had stepped out of another era entirely. The restaurant owner nearly dropped a tray when she saw him. Madonna, Mrs. Russo whispered under her breath before rushing toward the front herself. Damien barely acknowledged the attention around him. His eyes moved across the restaurant once, then stopped on me. My pulse stumbled so hard it almost hurt. For one terrifying second, neither of us moved. I was standing beside table 6, holding a tray of cappuccinos, while rain from 2 nights ago suddenly replayed itself inside my head. He recognized me immediately. I could see it in the way his expression shifted. Tiny, controlled. But there, Mr. Moretti, Mrs. Russo said nervously, "Your usual table is ready." He kept looking at me another second before finally nodding. "Thank you." His voice did something unfair to the air around, calm, smooth, quiet enough to make everyone else sound distant. I lowered my eyes quickly and forced myself to move again before the cappuccinos slipped from my hands. Do not stare at him, Claire. Do not think about him. Definitely do not remember the way he looked at you in the rain. But every nerve in my body already knew he was there. I could feel it from across the room. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Russo grabbed my wrist near the kitchen entrance. "Table in the back," she whispered urgently. "You take it personally." I blinked. Why me? Her eyes widened like I had asked something absurd. "Because he requested you." My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually faint. Slowly, I picked up the tray, holding black coffee and sparkling water. My hands felt cold again. Across the restaurant, Damien Moretti sat alone beneath soft golden light, watching me approach like he had been waiting for this moment all day. My heartbeat was so loud by the time I reached Damien Moretti's table that I barely heard the jazz music anymore. The tray trembled slightly in my hands, and I hated that he probably noticed. Men like him noticed everything. I set the coffee down carefully in front of him, while keeping my eyes lowered. "Your espresso," I said softly, "and sparkling water." "Thank you, Claire." The way he said my name again felt unfairly intimate, slow, deliberate, like it belonged somewhere near him. I straightened quickly and reached for professional distance before my nerves betrayed me completely. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked up at me then, really looked at me, not the way men usually did at restaurants. Not careless, not hungry, intentional, calm. It was somehow worse. Sit with me for 5 minutes. I almost laughed, because I genuinely thought I heard him wrong. "I am working. I know." His voice remained quiet, controlled. 5 minutes. Every instinct told me this was a terrible idea. Mrs. Russo was already pretending not to stare from behind the counter while the entire restaurant carefully acted like they were not paying attention. But Damien sat there like none of it mattered, like he was used to the world rearranging itself around his decisions. "I could lose my job," I whispered. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "No, you will not." It was not arrogance. That was the disturbing part. It sounded like certainty. Before I could answer, Mrs. Russo suddenly appeared beside me, carrying a tray of cannoli. She absolutely did not need to deliver herself. "Claire," she said a little too brightly, "why do you not take your break now?" My eyes widened. She refused to meet them. "Traitor." Slowly, I slid into the empty chair across from him while trying to ignore the fact that every person in the room suddenly seemed fascinated by their dinner plates. Damien leaned back slightly, studying me beneath the warm amber light hanging above the table. Up close, he looked even more composed than before. Expensive watch, sharp jawline, dark eyes that somehow carried both exhaustion and discipline at the same time. He looked like a man who slept 3 hours a night and trusted nobody with the other 21. "You disappeared after the rain," he said. I folded my hands together tightly beneath the table. "Most strangers do." You are not most strangers. The air between us shifted again. Dangerous territory. I looked away first, pretending interest in the candle flickering near the salt shaker. You should not say things like that to women you barely know. Then tell me something real. I blinked at him. What? Something honest. I stared for a second because nobody asks that anymore. Not really. Most people ask questions waiting for their turn to speak. Damien asked like the answer actually mattered. Outside the restaurant window, headlights blurred through the wet Manhattan streets while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Honestly, I said quietly, I think this is the strangest week of my life. That almost smile appeared again. Smaller this time, softer. Because of me, you are not helping. For the first time, he actually looked amused. It transformed him in a way the newspapers never captured. Less untouchable, more human. And somehow that made him even more dangerous to my common sense. You looked cold that night, he said after a moment. I was. But you danced anyway. I swallowed. Sometimes people do strange things when they are hurting. Silence settled between us briefly. Comfortable silence. The kind that sneaks up on you unexpectedly. Damien glanced toward the bracelet on my wrist again. You wear that every day. My fingers instinctively touched the silver chain. It was my mother's. Something changed in his expression then. Subtle, but real. How long has she been gone? 3 years. I am sorry, Claire. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Most people say sorry automatically. Damien said it carefully, like he understood grief well enough not to disrespect it. I found myself studying him before I could stop. You do not seem like the kind of man who apologizes often. His eyes held mine steadily. Only when I mean it. My chest tightened again. God, this man was dangerous in ways nobody warned women about. Not because he raised his voice. Not because he tried to impress me. Because he paid attention. Because he listened, like silence mattered. One of the security men approached quietly from the front entrance, then stopped beside the table. Sir, he said respectfully, the mayor has arrived at the event. Event, mayor, right. Men like Damien did not spend Friday nights lingering in cafes with broke waitresses, unless their lives were completely different from normal people. Damien barely looked away from me. Tell them I will be late. The bodyguard hesitated for exactly half a second before nodding and stepping back. I stared at him in disbelief. You are skipping some important billionaire thing because of coffee. Because of you. My breath caught hard enough to embarrass me. He said impossible things so calmly it made them feel real before logic could interfere. I stood too quickly, nerves finally overwhelming me. I should get back to work. Damien did not stop me. He only watched me with that same unreadable intensity while I tried to steady my breathing. Just before I turned away, he spoke again. Claire. I looked back. You looked less lonely in the rain. The words hit harder than they should have, because somehow, after only 2 conversations, Damien Moretti had already noticed the difference. After that night, Damien Moretti became impossible to avoid. Not because he chased me. Men like him did not chase anything. The world moved toward them on its own. But somehow, over the next few days, his presence kept slipping into my life like smoke under a locked door. Every evening, around 7:30, the black car appeared outside the cafe, always parked across the street, always quiet. Sometimes Damien came inside, sometimes he stayed in the back seat while his driver waited, but every single night, he was there. Mrs. Russo started fixing her hair whenever the car pulled up. The cooks whispered in Italian near the kitchen door. Customers glanced nervously toward the windows when security men stepped onto the sidewalk. And me? I pretended none of it affected me while my pulse betrayed me every time I saw him. By Friday, I knew his coffee order by memory. Double espresso, no sugar. Sparkling water with lemon. He tipped every employee generously without making a performance out of it. He spoke softly to everyone, never once raised his voice. Yet somehow the entire room adjusted itself, around his mood anyway. That kind of power should have frightened me more than it did. Maybe it would have if he looked at me the way he looked at everyone else. Cold, distant, untouchable. But with me there was always something else beneath the surface. Curiosity, maybe. Loneliness. I could not tell which one scared me more. Friday night was colder than usual. Wind rattled the cafe windows while people hurried through Manhattan in heavy coats, with their heads lowered against the weather. Inside, the restaurant glowed gold and warm beneath hanging lights. I was carrying fresh bread to table 4 when Damien walked in alone. No security beside him this time. No assistants. Just him in a charcoal coat dark enough to match the storm clouds outside. The entire room noticed immediately anyway. Some men carry power like a weapon. Damien carried it like silence. He sat at his usual table near the back, and before Mrs. Russo could even look at me meaningfully, I grabbed the coffee tray myself. "You are getting brave," she whispered with a grin as I passed her. "Or stupid." I approached his table, trying to ignore the heat rising in my cheeks. "Your espresso." Damien looked up from his phone slowly. "You remembered. You order the same thing every night. Maybe I like consistency." His eyes stayed on me another second too long. I set the cup down carefully. Most billionaires probably spend Friday nights somewhere more exciting. And most waitresses probably do not dance in the rain, like heartbreak turned into music. My breath caught unexpectedly. He said things like that too easily. Like poetry embarrassed nobody in his world. I folded my arms lightly. "Do you flirt with every exhausted woman you meet?" "No." The answer came immediately. Calm. Honest. Dangerous. My stomach tightened in a way I deeply disliked. That was a very fast answer. Because it is true. Around us, silverware clinked softly against plates, while old jazz drifted through the speakers overhead. Outside, snow threatened in the dark clouds, gathering over the city. Damien leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me with that impossible focus again. "You still look tired," he said quietly. I laughed under my breath. "That tends to happen when your entire life falls apart in 1 week. Tell me what happened." You ask very personal questions, for someone I barely know, then know me. The simplicity of that response unsettled me more than if he had tried to impress me. Most powerful men liked hearing themselves speak. Damien listened instead. I hesitated before sliding into the chair across from him again, mostly because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Fine," I said softly. My ex-boyfriend disappeared with my savings. I lost my apartment. My job fired me 2 days later. And now I am surviving on espresso and denial. Damien's expression never changed dramatically. But something dark flickered behind his eyes when I mentioned my ex. Not anger exactly. More like controlled disapproval. "He left you with nothing?" "Pretty much." Silence settled briefly between us. Then Damien reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a small ivory business card on the table between us. Thick paper. Elegant lettering. Just his name and a private number beneath it. "If you ever need anything," he said quietly, "call me." I stared at the card without touching it. "You barely know me. I know enough. And what exactly do you think you know?" For the first time, Damien leaned forward slightly. Not intimidating, just closer. His voice lowered enough that the rest of the restaurant disappeared around us. "I think you have spent your whole life surviving people who did not see your worth." My throat tightened painfully, because no one had ever described me so accurately that fast. I looked down at the table before my emotions embarrassed me in public. "You make very dangerous observations, Mr. Moretti." "Damien," he corrected softly. I swallowed hard. "Damien." God help me. Even saying his name felt intimate. He watched me for another quiet second before standing smoothly from the table. The movement immediately shifted the energy in the room again. People noticed when he moved. People always noticed him. He buttoned his coat calmly, while snow finally began drifting outside the windows in soft white flakes. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time. "You should not carry the world alone, Claire." Then he walked out into the Manhattan night, leaving his untouched espresso behind beside the card with his private number still waiting between my trembling hands. I kept Damien's card hidden inside the pocket of my coat for 3 days before finally admitting to myself that I had memorized the number without even trying. I hated how much space he occupied in my thoughts. It felt reckless, dangerous, like standing too close to the edge of something beautiful enough to ruin you. Every night after work, I told myself I would throw the card away. Every night, I slid it back into my pocket instead. Outside, Manhattan was shifting deeper into winter. Christmas lights had started appearing along Fifth Avenue, while cold wind rushed through the streets hard enough to sting my cheeks raw during late subway rides home. I was renting a tiny room above a laundromat in Queens now. The mattress leaned slightly to one side, and the radiator screamed like it was fighting for its life every few hours, but it was warm enough to sleep without my coat on. After everything that happened, that felt luxurious. Mrs. Russo had extended my job through the month, mostly because customers apparently liked me, or maybe because one particular customer kept returning often enough to make the entire staff nervous. Damien still came to the cafe almost every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with men in tailored suits, speaking quietly about business deals and city politics. But no matter who sat at his table, his eyes always found me eventually, like instinct, like habit. And every time they did, something inside me lost its balance for a second. The strangest part was how normal it started feeling. I began expecting the black car outside, expecting his calm voice, expecting the way the room subtly changed whenever he walked through the door. People feared him. I could see it clearly now. Not dramatic fear, controlled fear. Respect sharpened by caution. Men twice my size straightened when Damien entered a room. Restaurant owners personally greeted him. Wealthy politicians waited for him to speak first during conversations. Yet with me, he was always gentle. That contrast unsettled me more than anything else. Tuesday night, the cafe closed early because of heavy snow. By 10 o'clock, the streets looked silver beneath glowing traffic lights, while snowflakes drifted steadily onto parked cars. Mrs. Russo insisted on locking the doors herself, while muttering about irresponsible weather forecasts under her breath. "You should go straight home," she warned me, while pulling on her gloves. "Storm is getting worse." I nodded and stepped outside into freezing wind, sharp enough to steal my breath instantly. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck and started toward the subway station 3 blocks away. The city felt quieter under snowfall, softer somehow. Headlights blurred gold against the storm while distant music drifted from apartment windows overhead. I had almost reached the corner when I noticed the black SUV parked across the street. My steps slowed automatically. Tinted windows, familiar shape, familiar stillness. A strange feeling crawled up my spine. Not fear exactly, awareness. Before I could decide whether I was imagining things again, another dark vehicle rolled slowly around the corner behind me. Then another. I frowned slightly. That was new. Snow swirled harder through the streetlights while my heartbeat picked up for reasons I could not explain. The second SUV remained behind me as I walked. Not close enough to alarm anyone, just close enough to notice. I told myself not to panic. Wealthy people had security everywhere in Manhattan. Maybe I was being ridiculous. Maybe the city had officially made me paranoid. But the uneasy feeling stayed lodged beneath my ribs anyway. Halfway down the block, a familiar voice cut through the wind behind me. "Claire." I turned sharply. Damien stood beside the curb, near a black sedan, one hand resting lightly against the open car door, while snow settled across the shoulders of his dark coat. Relief hit me so fast, it almost embarrassed me. "What are you doing here?" I asked breathlessly. His eyes moved briefly toward the SUV farther down the street before returning to me. Calm. Focused. "You should not walk alone tonight." I tried to laugh it off. "It is Manhattan, not a war zone. Claire." Something in his voice stopped me. Not anger. Seriousness. The kind that quietly demanded attention. Snowflakes melted against his dark hair, while city lights reflected softly in his eyes. "Get in the car." My pulse stumbled again. "Damien, what is going on?" He looked past me once more, toward the street behind us, then back at me. "I think someone has been following you." The cold suddenly felt sharper against my skin. I turned instinctively toward the corner, but the SUVs were already moving, again through traffic like shadows disappearing into the storm. "You are probably imagining things," I whispered, mostly trying to convince myself. Damien stepped closer then, close enough that his voice no longer had to compete with the wind. "I do not imagine threats." The silence that followed felt heavy. Snow drifted slowly between us, while the entire city seemed to blur around the edges. Every instinct inside me screamed that stepping into Damien Moretti's car would change something permanently, maybe everything. But when he looked at me like that, calm and protective all at once, the truth became impossible to ignore. For the first time in weeks, standing beside the most feared man in Manhattan felt safer than standing alone. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at Damien, while snow drifted between us in complete silence. The city noise faded into the background. Taxi horns, distant sirens, footsteps crunching through slush on the sidewalks. None of it felt real anymore. Only him. Only the calm intensity in his eyes as he held the car door open like he already knew I was going to say yes. "Damien," I whispered carefully, "what exactly is happening?" His gaze moved briefly toward the street again before returning to me. "I would rather explain somewhere warm." That is not an answer. One side of his jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack I had seen in his composure since meeting him. "Claire, please, please." The word caught me off guard more than the fear did. Men like Damien Moretti were probably not used to asking for anything twice. Snow gathered along the shoulders of his dark coat while cold wind swept down the avenue hard enough to sting my eyes. Behind him, headlights reflected against wet pavement in blurred ribbons of gold and white. I looked toward the street corner instinctively again. The black SUVs were gone now. But somehow that did not make me feel better. Slowly, I stepped closer to the car. The driver immediately moved aside respectfully while Damien waited beside the open door without rushing me. That mattered more than it should have. Control like his could have easily become forceful. But around me, he never pushed. He only waited. I slid into the back seat carefully, and warmth wrapped around me instantly. Soft leather, low jazz music, playing quietly through hidden speakers. The faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne lingering in the air. Everything about the car felt calm in a way that made the storm outside seem far away. Damien got in beside me a second later, shutting the door softly behind him. The driver pulled away from the curb immediately. Silence settled between us as Manhattan drifted past the windows in silver streaks of snowfall and glowing skyscrapers. Damien loosened his gloves slowly before finally speaking. "Has anyone approached you recently?" I frowned. "Besides you?" His mouth almost twitched. "Besides me?" I leaned back against the seat, trying to think. "No." "Why?" He studied me for a second before answering carefully. "Because someone has been asking questions about you." My stomach tightened instantly. "What kind of questions?" "Where you work, where you stay, whether you are alone." Cold crept through me despite the heat inside the car. "That is not funny. I am not joking." His voice stayed calm, but something underneath it felt sharper now. Controlled tension. I stared at him, trying to understand how my small, ordinary life had somehow crossed into something this serious. Why would anyone care about me? Damien looked out the window briefly before answering. Because people notice when I care about something. Something, not someone. Something about that should have bothered me more. Instead, my heartbeat betrayed me all over again. And do you? I asked quietly before I could stop myself. His eyes returned to mine immediately. Yes, no hesitation, no games, just truth, spoken softly in the middle of a snowstorm. I looked away first, because suddenly breathing felt difficult. Outside, Rockefeller Center glowed beneath thousands of white lights, while couples hurried through the snow, laughing beneath umbrellas. Normal people, normal lives. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a luxury car beside one of the most powerful men in New York, trying not to unravel because he admitted caring about me like it was the simplest thing in the world. "This is insane," I whispered. Damien watched me carefully. "You are afraid. Should I not be? Not of me." The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Like he had already decided that somewhere deep inside himself, long before tonight. The car turned downtown smoothly, while snow continued falling heavier across the city. I rubbed my hands together nervously. "You still have not explained why someone would follow me." Damien was quiet for a moment. "There are people who dislike me. Claire, that sounds like the understatement of the century." Another almost smile. Brief. Gone quickly. "You have become visible beside me. That creates attention." I stared at him in disbelief. "I served you coffee 3 times. It was enough." God. The terrifying thing was that I believed him. I had seen the way people watched Damien, measured him, feared him. Men with power created gravity around themselves. And maybe without realizing it, I had stepped too close to his orbit. The car slowed finally in front of a towering building of glass and steel overlooking the river. Doorman immediately stepped forward beneath the glowing entrance canopy, while snow swirled around polished black umbrellas. I looked up at the massive penthouse windows high above us, and then back at Damien. "Where are we?" "Home," he said quietly. My pulse stumbled. "Yours? For tonight?" Every instinct inside me should have screamed no. Dangerous, reckless, impossible. But instead, as I looked at the man beside me, exhausted eyes softened by concern he clearly did not know how to hide, another truth settled painfully into place. Somewhere between the rain, the coffee, and the way he always said my name like it mattered, Damien Moretti had stopped feeling like a stranger. The lobby alone was bigger than my entire apartment building in Queens. Marble floors reflected warm golden light from chandeliers hanging 3 stories overhead, while soft piano music drifted somewhere through hidden speakers. Men in tailored coats nodded respectfully the second Damien stepped inside. Women behind the front desk straightened immediately, without being asked. Nobody stared openly at him. That was the strange part. They avoided staring the way people do around power they already understand. I walked beside him, feeling painfully aware of my worn boots and damp coat, while snow melted slowly in my hair. Damien noticed immediately. He reached out quietly and brushed a snowflake from my sleeve before I could react. The gesture was small, barely there. Somehow it affected me more than if he had touched my face. "You are freezing," he said softly. "I am fine. You are shivering." I wanted to argue, mostly because admitting weakness around him suddenly felt dangerous in an entirely different way. But the truth was, my hands had not stopped trembling since he mentioned someone following me. Damien guided me toward the private elevator, with one hand lightly resting near the small of my back. Not possessive, protective. The difference mattered more than he probably realized. Inside the elevator, silence wrapped around us, while the city slowly disappeared beneath rising floors of glass and steel. I watched numbers climb above the doors, while my pulse refused to settle. "Do women usually come up here?" I asked quietly before I could stop myself. Damien looked at me for a second, surprised enough to be honest. No. That was also a very fast answer. His mouth curved faintly. You notice that often. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, and for a moment I genuinely forgot how to breathe. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire living room, overlooking Manhattan like a field of stars. Snow fell softly beyond the glass, while the river reflected silver beneath the city lights. Everything inside looked calm, expensive, without trying to prove it. Dark wood, cream-colored furniture, shelves lined with books instead of decorations. A fire burned quietly near the far wall, filling the room with warmth that smelled faintly like cedar. It did not feel like the home of a monster. That unsettled me more than anything else. Damien removed his coat, slowly, while one of the staff members appeared from another room. "Tea for Miss Bennet," he said calmly, before I could protest. "And dinner." "I can order pizza somewhere," I interrupted quickly. "You do not need to feed me." Damien gave me a look that somehow made my argument feel childish without humiliating me. Claire. Just my name, low and steady, yet somehow enough to quiet every nervous defense I had left. The staff member disappeared discreetly, while Damien loosened the cuffs of his dress shirt. I tried not to notice how tired he suddenly looked beneath the warm lighting. Not weak. Just exhausted in a way wealthy men were apparently not supposed to appear. "Do you ever sleep?" I asked softly. One side of his mouth moved slightly, occasionally. "That is not an answer. You ask difficult questions." I crossed my arms lightly. "You started it." For a second, silence settled comfortably between us again, while snow continued drifting outside the windows. Then Damien walked toward the fireplace and poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher nearby. The city lights outlined his broad shoulders in gold and silver, while jazz music played quietly somewhere overhead. He handed me one of the glasses before speaking again. "I meant what I said earlier. About someone following me." He nodded once. "You were seen with me several times. Some people may interpret that as important." I stared at him in disbelief. "Because we drank coffee together?" "Because I do not usually bring people into my life." The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten painfully. I looked down at the water glass in my hands. "You barely know me." Damien stepped closer then. Not enough to overwhelm me, just enough that I could feel warmth radiating from him against the cold still clinging to my skin. "I know how you look at people when they speak," he said quietly. "I know you pretend to be stronger than you feel because life taught you nobody comes when you fall apart. I know you dance when your heart hurts, instead of asking anyone for help." My throat tightened instantly. "Damien, and I know," he continued softly, "that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the rain." The entire room seemed to still around us. The fire crackled quietly. Snow tapped gently against the glass, high above the city. Somewhere far below, Manhattan kept moving like nothing had changed. But something had, because no one had ever looked at me the way Damien Moretti did, like I was not temporary, like I was not invisible. My breathing felt uneven suddenly. "This is dangerous," I whispered. His eyes stayed on mine. "I know. You should probably stop looking at me like that." "I cannot." The answer landed between us softly, honestly. No games, no performance, just truth. My heart betrayed me all over again. Before I could respond, a phone buzzed sharply somewhere across the room. Damien glanced toward the sound, and for the first time since meeting him, I saw real irritation darken his expression. He walked toward the desk near the windows and answered quietly. I could not hear the entire conversation, only fragments. "No." Pause. I said, "Not tonight." Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice, lower, dangerously calm. She is not part of this. She. My stomach tightened immediately. Damien ended the call abruptly and stood there for a moment, facing the city skyline with one hand braced against the desk. Tension pulled across his shoulders beneath the white shirt. I realized then something I probably should have understood sooner. Whatever world Damien belonged to had finally noticed me too. I should have left that night. Any sane woman would have. The signs were all there. Powerful man. Dangerous world. Quiet warnings hidden beneath expensive suits and careful words. But instead, I stayed. Maybe because I was tired of surviving alone. Or maybe because somewhere along the way, Damien Moretti had started feeling less like danger and more like the first safe place I had seen in years. The staff brought dinner quietly after the phone call ended. Fresh pasta, warm bread, a bottle of sparkling water placed carefully between us, while soft jazz drifted through the penthouse. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked surprised to see me there. That unsettled me too. Like Damien's world, adapted instantly to whatever he decided mattered. He returned to the dining table, calmer than before, but I noticed the tension still sitting behind his eyes, controlled, buried deep. "You do not have to look at me like I am about to run," I said softly as he poured water into my glass. His gaze lifted slowly. "Are you?" I hesitated. "I do not know yet." That earned the smallest nod. Honest answers seemed important to him. We ate quietly for a few minutes while snow drifted against the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. The city looked unreal from up here. Tiny yellow taxis moving like scattered light beneath the storm, while the river reflected silver through the darkness. "Do you always live like this?" I asked eventually. Damien glanced around the penthouse briefly. "Like what?" "Like the world is waiting for your permission to breathe." For the first time that night, he laughed softly. Real laughter. Low and brief, but genuine enough to change his whole face. It caught me so off guard that I forgot to breathe again. God. Nobody in those newspaper photographs ever saw this version of him. "That is dramatic," he said. "It is accurate." His expression softened slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "Most people only see what they want from me. And what do they want?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Power, money, protection, influence. And what do you want?" The question settled between us gently. He looked at me for so long that my pulse started climbing again. "Peace," he said finally. Something about that answer hurt my heart unexpectedly, because suddenly I could see it clearly. The exhaustion beneath the expensive suits, the constant awareness in his eyes, the way he monitored every room instinctively even while pretending to relax. Damien Moretti did not look like a man who rested. He looked like a man who carried entire storms silently, so nobody else had to see them. "That is a lonely answer," I whispered. His jaw shifted subtly. "It is an honest one." Silence wrapped around us again. Comfortable now, dangerous in a completely different way. I realized then that I had stopped feeling nervous hours ago. Around Damien, fear slowly transformed into something warmer, something far more complicated. After dinner, he showed me the guest room himself. Not because he had to. Staff could have easily done it. But Damien walked beside me through the quiet hallway, like making sure I felt safe, mattered personally to him. The room was larger than my entire apartment in Queens. Soft cream blankets, warm lighting, a fireplace already glowing quietly near the windows. I laughed softly in disbelief. This room is nicer than anywhere I have ever lived, right? Damien stood near the doorway, watching me carefully. That should change. My chest tightened again. "You say things like that too casually." "I am not casual about you, Claire." There it was again, that impossible honesty. No games, no manipulation. Just truth spoken in a voice soft enough to ruin my common sense completely. I looked away before my emotions betrayed me visibly. "You barely know me," I whispered. "And yet," he said quietly, I know I worry when you walk alone at night. I know I notice when you are tired before you admit it yourself. I know the sound of your laugh has followed me through every room I entered this week. My throat tightened painfully. Nobody had ever paid attention to me like this before. Not really. Most people loved pieces of me. Convenient pieces. Damien looked at me like he wanted to understand all of it, even the broken parts. Especially those, why me? I asked softly. For a second, he looked almost surprised by the question. Then, his expression changed into something quieter, more vulnerable than I had ever seen from him. Because when you look at me, he said slowly, you do not see what I own first. The room fell silent after that. Only the crackling fireplace and distant wind against the windows remained. I realized then how lonely power must be, how exhausting it must feel wondering whether anyone around you sees the man before the empire. Damien stepped closer, carefully. Close enough that warmth radiated between us, while snow continued falling beyond the glass skyline. His hand lifted slightly, like he wanted to touch my face, then stopped halfway. Control again. Always control. You should sleep, he said quietly instead. I nodded, even though neither of us moved immediately. The space between us felt fragile suddenly. Intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with physical closeness. Finally, Damien stepped back toward the doorway, but before leaving, his eyes held mine one last time. Nobody is allowed to scare you again, Claire. The words were calm, simple. Yet, something inside me understood immediately that this was not a promise. It was a decision.